That's okay. Right, so welcome everybody. Welcome to number 2. Thank you for bearing with us. Thank you for coming along. I think on the basis of the first session, it was really popular, and we've actually already had people contact us to say, could you do the 5 series as a slightly compressed version in a day with a tenant group and some officers, so we can have some conversations about some of the things you raise in this and explore it as a landlord and tenants together. So we've got a couple of those, and we're just arranging dates now to say try and do a version of this as a follow-up in terms of tenants. So if that's of interest, do let us know, because as I say, it's been that's already come out of session 1. So just, you know me, you know there's going to be some slides. It's just the way it helps us show some of the things today in session 2. So bear with me and I will try and get my slides. These will be available afterwards, obviously. I'll do some introductions in a second as well. Just switch it. So Elizabeth, could you confirm that we're on full screen?
Oh, yeah, we're on full screen, can't see notes. Yeah, all good.
Brilliant. So welcome to WHQS Unpacked. Thank you for coming today. I'm David Wilson. Some of you know already, or if you've been to the first session. I've got a real interest in WHQS. I feel it's a great initiative, but it also needs discussion and transparency and interpretation. So my details are on there. You'll find me on LinkedIn. For some reason I'm under TPAS for Twitter and Facebook and Mastodon and things like that. So find me. And I've also got a guest today. We needed somebody to, I'm not the founder of all knowledge on everything, despite what I pretend at work. We have David Bolton here. He's asset manager at Pobble Group. Some of you might know him. He's worked at Valleys to Coast and Mellon. So I just want to say hello, David. If he's there, yeah.
Yeah, good morning all. Really happy to step in and support this and hopefully demystify some of the aspects of WHQS 23, Renting Homes Act, and Housing Health and Safety Rating System.
Big thank you, David, because you stepped in the very last minute. You don't know how last minute, after somebody wasn't able to attend because they were sick. So I'm very, very grateful to David and the Pobble Group for their time this morning. I need to mention we're very thankful for Lloyds Bank Foundation, who agreed to sponsor this event. It just meant the time and the research. It meant we could keep the cost effective for all of you. Lloyds Bank Foundation is an independent charitable foundation working in partnership with small and local charities and other organizations, communities, to the people that are facing complex issues and barriers, and to help support and overcome those barriers. As I say, a lot of their work is done across England and Wales, and it's obviously funded by the Lloyds Bank Group. So very grateful, and a big thank you to them. It's made these things a lot easier to run for you all. So we're here about Welsh WHQS. The standards are a great challenge. It's the biggest thing I think facing housing over the next 10 years. A lot of money, a lot of cost, and also a lot of opportunity and a chance to really make some wonderful homes out of it. The 5 sessions you hopefully have signed up to. We're on session 2 today, the technical standards. This is probably the hardest session out of them. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, because there's some technical bits in this, and this is why I needed David and some help today to help us steer our way through this. Just want a quick reminder of last time. We've got some deadlines. If you weren't at session 1, there are some deadlines you need to be aware of. They're defined in there, and we'll go a little bit more on some of this in further sessions. But there is a deadline of March 25, and for that, there are things that need to be done. Assess the condition of stock, and the estimate, engage with tenants regarding the programme, the very important one for TPAS, prepare and submit a compliance policy and update the business plan. So that's not far away. Last time you were here, I said it was 347 days away, or 248. Time's moved on already, and now Martin and my team tells me We're now only 238 working days away. Now, if you're the person in charge of this, if you include your own holidays and anything else you're going to be working on, that deadline is going to come fairly quickly. So, and we're also on version 2. I mentioned this last time that they just issued an update. We published a marked up version and it was quite popular and it was downloaded a number of times. So again, if there's anything if we see future ones, we'll make those marked up versions available to you. And last time, because this is an unpack session, we unpacked some of the issues, some of the tenant voice requirements, and there are requirements. They're not an option, they're a requirement about local prosperity, community benefits, and that tenant voice in the experience as we go forward and procurement. So we're going to move on to some different unpack today. And today we look really at the heart of WHQS, the real fundamentals. And if you're old enough, you might remember this fella from the 90s who talked about back to basics, about looking at the core values and principles. And I do think that's at the heart of today. We're talking about the things that really matter, real subjects: damp, noise, disrepair, fire safety, the things. WHQS is a wonderful thing of ambition in other things around garden. I get excited about water butts and what we're going to do to, make wildflower gardens and things like that. But these are the fundamentals in today, the things that really matter. And that's what we're going to go through. I thought put a quick selfie in there as an illustration of these. It's going to be some heavy lifting today. There is going to be some technical bits. And I'm hoping that between myself, the two Davids here, that we can help demystify it. But it is going to be the heaviest of the 5 sessions. So what has WHQS got to say about these fundamental subjects? Well, on literally the first page of WHQS, it sets out 8 objectives. You might be familiar with these already. I think we covered them in session 1. But this is what good looks like. This is what the WHQS seeks to achieve. You might be familiar with those 8, but today we're just going to focus on these ones: the state of repair, safe and secure, kitchens, utilities, and that all touches on comfortable and well-being. Let's say future sessions will focus on some of the other stuff like gardens and outdoor space. I hope you're still with me on this. The first thing I wanted to say is WHQS does not look to reinvent the wheel on certain things in these standards. There are new wheels in lots of WHQS, but in this part of today, we're not looking at reinventing the wheel. And what I mean by that is there's some key points to understand here. And this is wording from WHQS. It says, and I'll read it out, WH does not seek to set out the exact detail of certain technical standards when it comes to good state of repair. It relies on other defined standards. And some of the ones we're going to talk about today, I can never say this properly, and I wouldn't like to say it after a couple of pints. HHSRS, operating guidelines, and this is where David Bolton is going to really help me out on this. It also refers to rented homes, fitness for human habitation, Wales regulations. I don't know how many of them. It's another tongue twister. How familiar you are with that. And it also refers to something called secured by design. So they're going to be mentioned today, and I will explain them, or David will explain them as to what that means. And so to give an example, we've got here smoke alarms. So I don't want to, just to give an example, WHQS says for smoke alarms, page 12, under Rented Homes Act, landlords must ensure dwellings fit for human habitation on the day of occupancy, so the day you move in, and throughout the term. These standards are in the Rented Homes Act, and it defines them. Actually, Rented Homes Act then also gives some further standards, but I hope you see the point there that WHQS is not saying we're going to define it all now. We're going to refer to something that's already well thought out. It's already been discussed, it's already been scrutinized, and we follow those. If they get updated, that reflects on WHQS. Is that fair to say, David? Yeah. And the same with windows. This is another example. WHQS says external doors and windows, something really important to all of us, provide a level of physical security. That's page 14. And so again, the WHQS says, oh, let's not do this. It says it's got to be a reasonable level of security, it's got to comply with secure by design. But it doesn't have to have a secure by design certificate, but it is a design standard. It's an official police security initiative. There's a whole website there. And secure by design sets out standards that the police service accept or want to see in terms of crime prevention methods and ensure a good level of security. Does that make sense? So we will touch on it later, but as I say, WHQS is saying follow these guidelines. And it also, I missed a little bit out there, it does say if secure by design gets updated, then you've got to follow those updates. So there's a number of branches here that make it a bit more interesting, but also means that we should hope that the best practice in all these pockets, like fit for human habitation, secure by design, as they update, so does your home or the requirements of WHQS. Follow them. Now we're starting to get into the bits that get a bit heavy, right? So don't worry, this is I call this the slide of death. I'm not going to try and read it all. What I'm trying to say is that for a number of technical standards in WHQS, it starts talking about HHSRS. And what it says is refer to this hazard score rating. And we're going to go into what this all means in a minute. So you might be looking at that going, God, there's a lot of words on there. I did when I first started. What does this all mean? You know, talks about worse than the national average for a particular type and age, but we're going to get into that in a second. But some of the fundamentals, damp, disrepair, are following this technical set of guidelines. But yes and yet no, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. Those guidelines have a pass and fail, but WHQS goes a bit further sometimes. And so in this example of damp and mold, it says landlords should note in particular that a mere absence of a category 1 hazard does not constitute a pass. So in other words, if you have passed category 1, that does not constitute as a pass. This gets a bit complicated. Maybe I need to hand over to David in a minute. You could be in category 2, which is, if you're the local council, they would say, yeah, no, that's a pass. But WHQS says no, it's not a pass to them, because you still might have damp or minor examples in there. That it says the dwelling should be free from damp, including persistent condensation. And probably at that point, it might be worth me just handing over, or at least sharing this next section with David. We're going to talk about these housing health and safety rated systems. Is that so? David, do you want to start, or shall I just start listening?
Yeah, I'll jump in at this point. Firstly, to say that I'm not qualified in the sense of HHSRS insofar as I haven't undertaken the sort of in-depth training requirements of it. So if anybody on the call has, then I'm glad you're on mute, so that you can't heckle me for anything that I might interpret slightly differently. But just to add on to what David said, we had WHQS, we've now got WHQS 23, and the vast majority of WHQS requirements have passported through to 23, and then it's been added onto. It makes absolute sense that the WHQS regulations don't say this is everything that's required that you do, because as external things change, they then have to change those. So it is the case that if you look at WHQS 23, it will send you off to perhaps the Rent in Homes Act. It will send you off to HHSRS, which is how I'm going to relate to it, because otherwise it's a mouthful. So it does send those in those different directions. There are parts of WHQS as well which would exceed the HHSRS requirements. So if there is some persistent condensation mold growth in a property, that might essentially be not fine, but a low Cat 2 hazard for HHSRS, but WHQS says free from. So it's moving on from that perspective on it. Myself and David had a quick discussion around our love of acceptable fails, which are now conditional passes or temporary fails, and the fact that that could mask an awful lot of other perhaps issues, and we'll touch on that later on. But it can also be the case that there may well be persistent mold and condensation in a property, and that could be a conditional pass or a temporary fail for a variety of different reasons. But the HHSRS system, it's a good few years old now, and it was basically put in place to assess the risk of a property in terms of health and safety to the occupants or visitors to those properties. I'm going to ignore comments as they pop up at the moment, otherwise I will lose my drift. But basically it's a system whereby you will survey a property, you will identify potential risks and hazards, you will assign a score to those risks and hazards, and you will end up with quite an in-depth assessment of that property. If you take Pobble Group, there are 18,500 homes. I used to work for Valleys to Coast, and I've got some ex-colleagues on this morning, and there are about 6,000 there. What would be really difficult for landlords to do would be to carry out this in-depth assessment on every property. So you essentially get what I always think of as the funneling effect, which ends up looking and carrying out those in-depth assessments on those properties where you are led to identifying that there are much higher risks to them. The standard also takes into account the age and type of property. So to give a very brief example on that, there may be a different assessment made of a set of stairs in a 300-year-old cottage, which would be identified as a risk, but would it be lower scored compared to something built in the last 5 years? We'd expect that much higher standard to be in place, and the remedying of any of those measures being much more straightforward. So it's, as I say, it's in place. It identifies those risks, but what it also does is identify category 1 and category 2 hazards. In the most basic of language, if something is identified as a category 1 hazard, so this is independent of running through and getting a score from 0 to many thousands, but if anything is identified as a category 1 hazard, that stands alone as a hazard, and it's for the landlord to then address and remedy those hazards. If it's a category 2 hazard, it's identified as being less serious, not necessarily being any immediate risk to health and safety, and it is dealt with differently, and not necessarily through serving notice, etc. Whilst we as social landlords have that duty, and particularly the Renting Homes Act, because the HHSRS has always been there. What has happened now with Renting Homes Act and WHQS 23 is they've brought them directly into it. So in terms of how we have to look at things, you've got 2 sections to that, really. You've got FFHA, which is fitness for human habitation, that relates to a smaller number of sections which are around electrical safety, carbon monoxide and fire safety, smoke alarms, etc., and safety of gas appliances. Those that sort of side of life. What you've then got, and forgive me, these are how they are referred to, are 29 matters and circumstances, and those sit within rent. There you go. Thank you, David. Those sit within HHSRS, but they are also specifically a part of Rent in Homes Act, and because of the way that WHQS 23 is set up, that tracks back to it. So these effectively, if you're looking at WHQS 2023, you are looking at these hazards, these matters and circumstances. As you can see within those, there are, there will be a score, if you like, which can be assigned from from a full HHSRS assessment. But I think as we've said, it would be a significant task to carry out that full assessment. Ultimately, the local authority are the ones who would, if they recognise that there were hazards and associated risks, that could carry out that full assessment, and then sort of take enforcement action against that landlord, be it a social landlord or be it a private landlord. But yeah, the HHSRS, essentially the property is inspected for deficiencies, and that's by somebody who is competent in completing the assessment. Hazards may be identified. There is a deficiency in a score attached to those, and that's around the likelihood of harm, the impact of that harm, etc. There's a hazard score and band that comes through at the end, and then corrective action has to be taken. So I mentioned the likelihood of harm being in place, and the outcomes of them. So, something that would be likely to lead to death or serious injury to an occupant or a visitor is going to score much more highly than something that isn't. And you have those hazard bands there. So as you can see from that, a property will pass even if there are hazards, or a property will be deemed to be habitable even if there are passes in place, some of which will have to be addressed, some of which can't. Once you get to 1,000 or more, that is where there is a fail, and that is where enforcement action would come in. Let's say you've got those bans, you've got those requirements for that your minimum requirements that a home has to meet. What you will also have in place then are those individual hazards that can be identified, which would be Category 1, this needs to be addressed immediately. Category 2, there can be an improvement plan in place for that. If you could pop onto the next slide, please, David.
Look at the detail, yeah.
Yeah. Every home doesn't need to have an HHSRS assessment. Every home will have a stock condition survey, hopefully within a 5-year period. And I've offered, if you want me back to come back and talk about decarbonisation and WHQS in particular, but every home won't need to have one of these assessments, as we've said, because they are very, very detailed, and you'd like to think that if Pobble Group are handing over the keys to a new property today, somebody, that there are none of those hazards in place. It is sometimes the case that they can be some subsequently identified, but it's absolutely the case that if that's a new home coming through, there should be no requirement whatsoever for the assessment to be done. If Pobl buy a property that was built in, in the early sort of 20th century, it's a different story. Those properties built at that time will have potentially have fundamentally very different requirements or sort of legislative requirements at that time. Or it could well be the case that, and I keep on picking on Pobl Group because it's who I work for, but it could well be the case that Pobl bought a property in the 1980s, which was 100 years old, did the work, which was deemed to be okay at that time, but with moves in legislation, with changes in standards, it's not now. So those are the properties that that time, effort, expertise needs to be spent in making these assessments, and it would also be the case that in terms of our regulation by Welsh Government and compliance with WHQS 23 Renting Homes Act, that we would make that assessment of all properties, but it wouldn't be the full HHSRS. Again, when myself and David talked about this, it's one of those areas to say, well, how do we know that we are compliant? And some of this involves people getting out, going into homes, looking, making those assessments. Those other parts of it are what we can understand from those everyday activities that we undertake, in terms of carrying out stock condition surveys, carrying out repairs, carrying out planned maintenance, that sort of thing. So to take one of the easier examples of it, one of the 29 matters and circumstances relate to lead piping in water supplies. We will know that everything built after a certain date will not have any lead piping in place for it. We also then know, and can check through from records that where we've bought a 150-year-old property, that has been replaced at that time, and there's a record of that, and it will always funnel down to then that smaller percentage to go, we're not sure, we'll go and look at those. So there is that part of it that there are areas that we will know, yep, we are compliant in that, and there are those areas that we will say we need to go and do a lot more investigation. And I think HHSRS, a couple of the major areas that those potential hazards will impact on households are going to be in relation to damp, mold, condensation, and mold and condensation are quite often very different to damp. Damp tends to be an issue with the fabric of a building. So you've got a leaking roof, or you've got walls which are allowing water ingress, that sort of thing. Mold and condensation can arise from those, but it can also arise from that house not being very energy efficient, not having a great heating system in there, not having good ventilation systems, etc., being too expensive to be able to adequately heat. So that's where it does come back to, if we built a new property and the heating and ventilation wasn't sufficient, then one of those new properties could then fall back into requiring those assessments on it. But again, there are so many checks, measures, balances, building regulations, minimum design requirements that absolutely shouldn't be the case on it. So there are those areas that we can funnel down and know that very quickly establish this isn't an issue. There are some other areas then in terms of HHSRS compliancy, which are complaint or demand led. So noise is quite a good example of that. And in an HHSRS sense, noise doesn't include antisocial behavior noise. That's a very different one. It's noise that is worsened by the design or other factors of that property. And from that perspective, the noise is issue led, so it's reactive for us as landlords rather than proactive, because we wouldn't carry out a noise assessment on 18,000 homes, but where people, where households do say that there are excessive noise being experienced, we can then react to that, look, and establish why and establish remedy.
So can I ask a couple of questions then? So that's a good point. So like you say, some will be led by legislation, gas safety, electrical safety tests, things like that. Some, like noise, if you haven't had a complaint, you'll make an assumption that it is compliant with noise.
Yeah,
we
will make we will make that assumption, but I think as landlords, what we've also got to be really conscious of is the sound of silence. Not in a noise sense, but just because something isn't, it may be the case with noise, with mold and condensation, etc. Just because something isn't doesn't come through to us, doesn't mean that it's not there. It could be that our customer is completely fed up with us because we never do anything about it, etc., etc. So we have to be reactive, but we have to be conscious of that as well. And in terms of mold and condensation, again, POB will have a lot of sort of 3-story Victorian properties that have been divided into flats. If there are issues being experienced in one of those homes of mold condensation, but nothing comes from the others, we don't then assume that the others are fine, and we look at that. We look, it's a case of, okay, let's do that further investigation, and the same with noise. So it's got to be that sort of the widest view when issues start to come through to us.
Okay. So before we move on to the next section, I've got a couple of questions. People, do they factor into that risk assessment? Who's living in that property that we're talking about? Yeah,
they do. Yes, yes. So there will be different factors that come into play. For a 1-bedroom flat in older persons accommodation, through to a 3-bedroom home. So they play that part in HHSRS. But I think where we've talked about the connectivity of all of this, they also, it's some things will supersede other things. Renting Homes Act is a piece of legislation, so essentially that sits at the top of the tree of, thou shalt or thou shalt not do things. But if you look at then look at WHQS 23, that is very much focused on the people in that home as well, and the people in there now, and the people likely to be in there. So it's, without straying into the next couple of weeks, if you look at decarbonisation and making homes much more energy efficient, what we have to do as landlords is not just look at, and when I talk about the fabric of the building, that I just forgive me if I'm teaching anyone to suck eggs, but you're talking about the floor, the floor slab, the walls, and the roof essentially. But you don't just look at the stock condition aspect of it and then go, oh right, what's the current energy performance like, and what else can we do? There's another really vital part of that, which is the occupancy assessment. So I'm sure that unfortunately there are lots of all social landlord customers who are quite used to and fed up of the landlord turning up and doing stuff to their home rather than doing stuff with them. The big change now in terms of how that everything has to be done is spending time with the occupants of those homes. And it's much the same then in terms of it's much the same then in terms of HHSRS. As I said, it takes account of the age and the design of that building in terms of what's acceptable, but it does then recognize that there is a more significant, if you've got a first floor room and and there's a window that opens wide and it's only 300 mil a foot above the first floor level, there are different levels of risk according to different occupants. So it does look at that part of it, but it does tend to come down to go, if there's a risk, it's a risk of, regardless of whether there's that photo of David lifting the weights that we saw there earlier on, or if there's older people or younger people. So it does account for that, but it tends to say occupancy can change. So that risk will be.
Yeah. But one other question, it was talking about to meet the ideal. I struggled when I was reading some of the guidelines on it. It keeps coming up, the deficiencies of failure to meet the ideal, and it talks again, I think in here, about how different the condition is from the ideal. What does that mean? Because I don't know if you can answer that, but I've struggled with that concept of what is to meet the ideal.
It's always difficult to, because I think there are over 100 of us on today, and I think if we ask the question for a single element of ideal, we'd probably have 100 different answers to it. But in an HHSRS sense, the ideal is something that pulls down that risk score as low as it can be, having account for financial, physical constraints, etc. So the ideal is that where those identifiable risks are addressed and minimized, so that so you've got a property which without knocking it down and starting again is more or less where it needs to be.
So would it be fair to say, like you talked about, an old staircase of a building wouldn't necessarily meet some of the standards now, but an ideal, at least put a rail in or something to try and reduce that risk of that staircase. Yeah.
It's one of the 29 hazards relates to risk of entrapment. I'm 26. Yeah, it could well be 26 collision and entrapment. And if you think back to the sort of 60s and 70s, lots of homes were built with what are called ranch style banisters. And they were absolutely fine at the time. However, now it's recognized that there can be a risk, if somebody falls, there can be a risk of entrapment within that, or there can be a risk of being able to climb over those, because they're essentially, a very small ladder, and fall in there. So that's one of those that was acceptable at that time, but is recognized as a potential hazard in HHSRS, but also in WHQS, and because it's here in renting homes. So if you take that example, and you take older Victorian properties, which might have had a stair rail going up, no hand banisters, and that stair rail was only, say, 800 mil high, there are risks there. Those can be addressed, so you can make those changes. If you've got a 200-year-old property with a stone staircase, and every one of those steps and risers is a different depth, it's a different height, it's not uniform at all, then HHSRS would recognize the age and nature of that property and go, well, that sits there, but there's not a lot that can be done with it without ripping out that staircase and possibly the rest of the house falling down around it.
Okay. So I'm just going to give David a break there, just to cover a couple of bits there. Thank you for this so far. I'm sure there's going to be some questions in a minute. So we talked about there's no requirements, but landlords have to detail how they tend to comply. What I pull out here, again, there's a lot of information on here. What I was trying to make the point here was each of these standards we're looking at today, structural, free from damp windows, have in WHQS, see this detail. And that was the theme at the beginning of this session, where as they update, then so does WHQS, you know. So there's a lot in here. And my view is, if your tenants here or tenant groups, or you got tenant officers here, is we need to look at tenant group to scrutinize or to collaborate on some of the detail, but not all of them. Stairs and balustrades are technical requirements where technical people need to know technical stuff to assess them. I don't know whether that's a good use of tenants' time trying to inspect stairs and balustrades, you know, whereas damp and mold and things like that is a more open conversation. So it goes through here, gas appliances, you know, a qualified person comes and does that assessment. I'm not qualified to, you know, to join a tenant group or to do something around, well, do we think they're complying with it? Do we think they're doing them right or not? That we rely on professional qualification, professional training for certain things. And you can see there's a number. That's why this section is not defined in WHQS, but says follow these good guidelines. And so when we come on to more of this, and David might jump in a minute, certain things like fire risk warnings, right? When I was unpacking this, I was like, oh God, it's 2 pages of really technical, hard work. And I'm like, oh God, how do I explain this? And it's referring to British standards, referring to all sorts of stuff. I think the issue for us, for tenant groups and for frontline officers, is actually we need to focus on, we need people to do those things. And we've got a tenant group's got to ask, you know, are we tracking the compliance? Are we tracking the reporting? Is my building up to compliance? When was the last time? Is it being published? Is there a risk assessment we can see? And also tenant awareness of these risk fire standards. So are they aware of, is it stay put? Is it leave? Are they aware of the evacuation procedures, the meeting points, things like that? And I think that's the conversations I think tenants and landlords need to have those conversations about. Let fire service, because they're involved in this, and there's council involved in it, depending on the type of building, especially with high rise and stuff. There's a whole new sets of standards on that. And quite honestly, I don't think we need to know that. We need to know, though, that the right people are doing the work and that we're seeing and tracking to ensure that they're happening. I don't know if that's a fair thing to say, David, but I think that's where we've got to focus our time and energy. I think, you know. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I think there are areas that impact to a greater and lesser extent, and what you will have in every social landlord organization are people whose specific role is building fire safety. And having worked for a few different housing associations, they are a pain in the neck, but they're a pain in the neck in a good way. You know, it's absolutely the case that there are experts in place to assess and judge and work, you know, and work out the safest way of addressing things. I think for our customers, they've got to have 2 things. They've got to have the assurance that their homes are safe, and they've then got to have that understanding that if they ask questions, then those questions are answered and sort of demonstrated back to them in terms of safety. Thereafter, it's about you know, ensuring that you are safe in your home, but also ensuring that in the event that something may happen, it's absolutely clear to that household what they should be doing.
I hope that makes sense to people. Let's say we could look at some more of these, like if we look at noise, I think Dave's already covered this. it covers the exposure to noise inside the house from insufficient sound insulation. So I remember spending a nightmare night in a hotel where I was pretty much next to the lift shaft going up and down all night, and the doors were pinging outside there. There was a noise coming in. And I say that's what WHQS is saying. It's not covering unreasonable noisy behaviors. And I think there's mentioned this already. It's looking at, is there a hazard to this building from the outside, from things that are above, below, things like this. And therefore, any antisocial behavior is covered by a different policy, a different assessment, and a different process. Now, it might be, if there's a noise complaint, they might look at this and assess it first. Is it the fabric, or is it an external factor? And so WHQS doesn't define how to fix those things. If it decides it's the fabric or the build, or the right to quiet enjoyment there. So it doesn't say how you need to do these things. It never does. It'll give suggestions. Here's some suggestions on what land from WHQS, where it says, but it doesn't say. It just says you should consider some of these followings. So these are classic ones where the plumbing is, where the bathrooms above someone else's living room, things like this in flats. And a lot of this is around the flats and stuff. Triple glazing maybe near airports or sorts of high noise. We've got a number of properties, along the M4 corridor, can get interesting there. So these are the things that need to be suggested. And therefore, on this one, on noise, again, it goes back to factor in what things can we influence, what discussions do we need to know. If a tenant believes the property is not is suffering from noise, can they ask for an assessment? Can they see the report? Do they need to see? Is the report a technical report though? Is an appeals process? And after the work's done, is it reassessed? I don't know, David. Do you know if you had somebody you did an assessment, does it get reassessed after the work, or does it get signed off as compliant now?
It's noise is the transmission of noise, which isn't due to unreasonable behavior, etc., is quite a difficult one. And in the past, they tended to be a sort of school of thought of that, of if this is traditionally built, then it's fine. It comes back to older buildings that have been converted, but it's not the case. There are older blocks of flats that were built that will have those issues. So I think from a customer perspective, if you feel that you are suffering unreasonable levels of noise, either because of the construction or the location of that property, and you ask for that to be assessed and investigated, and your landlord sort of comes along, has a look, says, no, we think it's fine, and goes away, then your next port of call has to be the local authority, the environmental health officers, to get that HHSRS assessment part done of it, and you can then automatically see their
that appeal process would be the council then, right?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. But in the first instance, then it does need to be getting through to the landlord on it, and yes, getting that assessment done, whether that that brings the outcomes or not, then essentially the appeal process is getting through to the local authority. Okay. There should be a before and after assessment made. And if there's not, then the after assessment is either there is still this noise, or that there isn't this that hasn't resolved. It's either resolved it or not. On new builds and conversions, yes, we should be able to assume that those have been designed in such a way as to minimize the unreasonable transfer of noise. Sadly, it's not always the case. It does, it tends to be that that if it's new build, houses or flat maisonettes, that they've been designed in such a way, conversions can be much more difficult. And I think back to a very previous life when I worked for Wales and West Housing in Bridgend. And we had a scheme there that was a conversion of the old workhouse in the middle of Bridgend, and that did suffer a lot of noise transfer from the first floor to the ground floor, and that that ended up with temporarily moving residents out, doing a lot of sound insulation works, and then moving people back in. So it's something that landlords do or should take seriously. And if your landlord doesn't, then tell David and he'll tell me.
Yeah, I will. Yeah. People contact us all the time. I want to mention kitchens as the last section, just because I know it's a popular one. We get asked about a lot, and there's some new stuff in there or clarified things on there. It is 3 pages long in WHQS. I don't really supposed to go through it all, but the aim is homes should have an up-to-date kitchen and utility area. That's what we want. And the kitchen is such an important part of our homes. So there are a couple of things in there, the pass notes, if we call them here. Kitchens over 16 years should be replaced unless in good condition. And I think this is an interesting conversation, because what is good condition? Mine is 14 years and it's still great. It's still got quite a lot of life in it. Who's going to decide what good condition? Does the tenant want to keep it, or does it just require I need a couple of screws and just a couple of adjustments on some of the doors, and I think it's got a lot of life in it. I think this is going to be an interesting one going forward, where I think tenants could have mature grown-up conversations, because every new kitchen comes at a huge cost, and that reflects in rent, and that reflects in other things. So I think there's something there about getting tenants involved to co-create definitions of that. But equally, just because you like the kitchen doesn't mean to say it's compliant. And that might be a reason why it needs to be replaced. There's, again, our friend HHSRS coming up with, got to pass certain regulations on it. It also talks about a work triangle. I have no idea what this was until I started reading it, but it talks about the movement around the kitchen and where the washing facility is versus food preparation and stuff. And I think that's an interesting one for tenant groups and stuff. Do they need to know? I was with a tenant inspection group last Friday in the Vale of Glamorgan, and they're walking around looking at retrofit works that have been done. And I wondered how much technical knowledge they needed, how much training did they need to? Because would they know if they were looking at some works done on kitchens that it was compliant with the work triangle, or do we just rely on the people who are fitting it? I think there's an interesting conversation there about who does the checks, who inspects the work. Some of these are fairly just, again, done by technical definitions. Kitchens organised, especially work surface, storage. This is another interesting one. WHQS says that it doesn't give an option really, but it says it must be the childproof or lockable storage for cleaner materials. I don't have that. I don't know how many of you have that. I don't know if I even want it, because my son's 15. I'm hopefully a competent adult. Child locks and things, or things like that, I lock on it every time, getting the key. That would be an inconvenience for me. And it's also a cost to the landlord, but that's what it's saying. And I think that's another grown-up conversation we need to have between tenants and who needs it, and or is it that they have to do it? And they've got to put that in because that's what the WHQS says. I would hope that there is grounds for conversations around something like that, because it's just been inconvenience to me, and there's a cost. It's going to reflect on my rent. This one, I think 4E is going to be an interesting one going forward, which was, it now says you have to have provision for recyclables and storage of food waste in homes. Not always in the home, it can be internal, external. I think that's going to be a minefield. I think that's going to be really interesting. Again, I see grown-up conversations about what they mean by that. Where do they think external storage? we use an example in our work office, the new regulations coming about recycled material. The landlord's decided the food caddy is 5 floors down and in the back of a thing, single one for the building. That's not accessible for us, and no one's using it. They're just chucking tea bags in the bin. I don't think that's working, and I think this would be an interesting one. For those of you who've got multiple gadgets and power and everything else, it does define how many sockets in there. Again, there will be exemptions. Some people couldn't physically need 6 sets of double sockets, twin powers in there. Just be too much. Again, I think you've got to have that sort of grown-up conversations about it. Flooring I'm not going to cover, because I think flooring is in number 4, where we look at the whole of types of floorings and fabrics of buildings. So I'll move on from that. But this is another one that I thought was interesting. Most of us have space for a washing machine. Most of us have some form of external drying. Some of us have still got an airing cupboard. I think that will change when we start putting tanks back in. But there was an interesting one here. It says, especially if we've got flats above shops. My brother lives in a flat above a shop. He has no external space. He has no airing cupboard. It's just a combi. Therefore, it's saying here that if it's not possible to provide an external drying line, there's no communal drying facilities, landlord must provide an energy efficient tumble dryer. That's going to be a very small amount of people, but I wonder, do the tenants who are in those properties know that, and what are the implications for them? And so it's a niche subject, that, because I would hope most people have a form of external space. But as we convert shops over the next decade, or sorry, above shops, we convert bits of office space, I wonder, and city centre locations, whether that will be a case.
It's sorry, I just jump in because it's always an interesting point, but it's the case as well, David, that that if there are no current internal or external facilities for drying clothes, inevitably those clothes will be put on a radiator or put on an airer or put on something similar, and which then leads to the old enemies of condensation, increased water vapor, condensation, mold. So it's absolutely something that needs to that really needs to be thought through, where there aren't those current facilities. And I think my concern with that is that it's not many properties, but there's an absolute additional cost to the landlord to go, here's a tumble dryer, and if we do it, we will inevitably gift or sell you that tumble dryer for £1, because we don't want to come and service it on an annual basis or have any responsibility for it whatsoever. But they're expensive old things to run, and they take up space in what might be a smaller flat anyway. So that would be an interesting one to really talk through together and develop those approaches.
And that's what I think we're looking for. Just that sort of grown-up conversations need to focus on the measures and subjects they can influence. I don't want to spend a lot of time in a scrutiny panel examining the methods of electrical safety. I think there are other things tenants and people can spend their time on. I also just wanted to mention there, the secured by design is a standard for windows and doors, but it's going to come up in session 3. I did reflect on this last night, thinking maybe we could run something about what secured by design is. What does it mean? We need to run session 3 first, but I'm going to see if I can find a speaker or something for that. So just want to mention, that was number 2. We've still got another 3. I'm going to come off the slides in a minute, and Akshita probably wouldn't let me go without saying we've got a really interesting report coming out next week. For those of you interested, it's free. It's next Thursday, just after lunch. We've been tracking for 4 years now tenant attitudes to energy efficiency, affordable warmth, their attitudes to a number of in this type of fields. So it's a free session next Thursday. Do sign ups on our website, or Elizabeth might put it in the chat or something like that. So I'm going to come off the slides. Elizabeth, is there anything I need to stop sharing? Right back in the room. I haven't been able to see any of the chats so far. So is anyone agree, disagree?
Yeah, we've had a few questions throughout, so I've kept a log. Dave O'Connor asked, if an external door doesn't have a secure by design certificate, how will a tenant know if it complies?
That is a good question. And essentially for secure by design for doors and windows, a window or door manufacturer will say this is the door window, these are the locking mechanisms, these are those, and there will be that certificate issued, and all social landlords should be should absolutely be ensuring that the windows and doors that they specify are secure by design. I think to answer that question, that if a window or a door doesn't have a secure by design certificate, then it's up to your landlord to either demonstrate that it is secure by design, or to go and find that certificate, or take some form of remedial action.
Should the tenant have the certificate?
I think it's that again. That's a good question, and I think that would be on a case by case basis, because from my personal perspective, when you look at the amount of certification that relates to somebody's home that you could theoretically have, there's an awful lot of it.
Yeah.
So I would say in the first instance, then your landlord needs to be able to demonstrate to you that that does comply with secure by design requirements, and then pass that certificate onto you. But again, going back to a public perspective,
I think that we'll cover some of that in, I think, number 5, which is going to be around compliance, acceptable fails. Because I've always had an issue with WHQS 1 was, did the tenant know that somebody had signed their property off as acceptable fail or temporary pass or whatever? Did they even know that? And I think that's a subject for number 5. And I'm also going to bring in the subject of building passports, or a portal where you can see your certificates and things like that. Because again, that's told well before. Yeah.
I know something really good, and Valleys to Coast did lots and lots of good things, but something that was very good that Valleys to Coast did was that when a new household came into a property, they would issue them with a WHQS certificate that says, your property passes, fails, and passes WHQS, and these are what we deem to be the acceptable fails at this moment in time. So yeah,
transparency is going to be, I think, the heart of session 5. I feel that's what's missing at the moment. Good work, good standards, lots of good people doing stuff. But transparency, I think. Olivia, the slides today, yes, that'll be sent out later.
I've got the questions here, David.
Right.
So we had another question of Vicky Shenton. What are your thoughts on the level of tenant engagement and input into the standards? That's one part of the question, and then we'll answer the second part in a minute.
Okay, so I could cover the first bit. When the standards were developed, it went over a number of years, and we ran a number of sessions with tenants, with officers, inputting into it. There was also splinter groups like Elizabeth's Flooring and things like that. I think there was a number of different ways that TPAS did that. Certain landlords also had their own ways of inputting into the standards to form it. We also saw as drafts as well, and as the board and myself examine those drafts. And I met with CHC and lots of different organizations arguing about the before it came out, looking, and there was some amendments pushed in for more tenant participation, more tenant engagement in there. So
I think I could probably add to that one as well. There were a lot of things noticed in the previous WHQS standard, and Welsh Government themselves acknowledged that they hadn't engaged with tenants enough throughout the first WHQS standard. And whilst tenants, a large proportion of tenants did know what it was, they didn't know if their house was actually compliant in the first place. And if it was, then what were the acceptable fails? So not everybody did what Valleys to Coast did. And in the 5th session, where we're looking at monitoring the standards, I think that's where we can discuss this in a lot more detail about what tenant engagement is going to look like and how tenants can monitor the standards moving forward. The other part of the question was, how are that you involving and engaging tenants in the new WHQS standard, and what percentage of tenants is deemed an acceptable level of engagement, which I think is a really good question.
It really is. Again, this is something that David and I discussed. WHQS 23 standard says you've got to have a WHQS policy, and you've got to consult with residents. And all social landlords would have had their original WHQS policy, because that was a requirement, and that will be built on and expanded because the new standard is has got those additional areas in it. It's something within Pobble Group we are pulling together now, because if I went back sort of 15, 20 years to my Mellin Homes days and consultation, then I think what we probably did at that time was consult with the customer groups that we had. But I think as well, we probably did write out to about 4,500 households going, this is what we've got to do. What do you think about it? Send it back in this stamped address envelope, because the world was very different then. I absolutely think the WHQS 23 standard, there's very little in there that is optional. There are options in there to be able to look and say, this is impossible to do for this particular property, etc., etc. So you've got your temporary fails and your qualified passes, which in the old language was the acceptable fails, which I've always thought was a wonderful thing to have a fail that was acceptable. But I think it's absolutely critical that for every landlord, the implementation of this new standard is absolutely carried out hand in glove with residents, with customers. One of the biggest there are smaller impacts in WHQS 23. One of those is water butts, which David has mentioned. Water butts where feasible, etc., etc. Everything, they're not much of a cost individually, but if you times them by 2 properties and 15,000 properties, they become a big cost, and not everybody wants them. So there's an area there which I think is very much.
We're going to cover that actually in next week's tenant polls, because we polled people on this subject.
So there's an area of consultation there. But if you look at one of the biggest changes is energy efficiency, decarbonisation, and that will absolutely undoubtedly lead to homes reacting very differently to, or potentially reacting differently to, being lived in to how they are now. So it's absolutely one of those that the minimum I would expect every organisation to be doing is whatever official and unofficial means they've got of engaging with residents, getting that started now, be that with groups or be that with focus groups, etc. But then moving it on from that to understand.
What we saw with, I think, the old Ty Ceredigion and Carmarthen, they had a dedicated WHQS tenant group that had a knowledge and a training, and were able to discuss some of these grown-up conversations that I keep mentioning, that I hope people have. But there was also then communications out to other tenants, and just about some of the things that were happening, and to get their views on it. So it's a 2-tier, and that's why some landlords have engaged us since, as we started this series, to help them with that strategy. I think it's got to be done by next March, the strategy for this.
I think there should be a TPAS Community Housing Cymru group that really brings people together, and I think then that's, landlords will want to do it differently, but I think that needs to flow out. But absolutely, there needs to be extensive consultation, and it needs to be meaningful consultation.
So we've got some more questions coming in, because I know we can talk about this for hours and hours. And we have had something from Claire about will blocking ranch style balustrades be done tidily, or just a plywood cover? This affects the tenant's home and decorating costs, plus future effects, replacing carpets, working around stair lifts, etc. And I think it's a really good point that, like, there's all these things that we need to do because of WHQS, but it's almost, that's still a tenant's home that they want to look nice. So, and they want it to look tidy and feel nice. So, you know, is there an example of what that would look like?
That will absolutely vary from landlord to landlord, and I agree completely that if you've got a ranch style balustrade on your first floor, and that landlord comes along and says we're going to put 12mm ply on there and leave like that, that ain't acceptable. That is not acceptable in any way, shape or form. It needs to be done properly, and it needs to be finished properly. So there is absolutely that part of it. The good practice approach to that would be to come along, agree the solution, put that in place, have it decorated, and
Agree the solution with the tenant, that individual.
Yeah.
See, that's what comes out of our tenant policies all the time, is that individual focused approach, and I know it's hard, and I know we've got so many properties in Wales to comply with, but it's also people's homes that they're going to be living in, and they should be having that individual plan.
We're going to cover it in session 3, Elizabeth. When we put in these new systems and stuff, there's going to be a make good, we call it, where we've taken something off the wall, like the combi and things. I think that's one that really needs conversation with tenants on an individual, but also at a group level, to develop policies on what does make good mean, what does it mean for the rest of the carpets, and
absolutely. Claire also mentioned how the tumble dry solution is mental, because in the cost of living crisis, which I don't disagree with, because there's not one tumble dryer that's cheap to run.
No.
But then what are they meant to do? I guess that was the argument. You've got no outdoor space, you've got no airing cupboard, that was the solution. It might be there's another way, with heat recovery systems, there might be other ways we can do it, but it is mental. I don't have a tumble dryer because I just feel fundamentally against it, in the current environmental.
We've got one, but I've taken the plug off it, but don't tell Bridget. But no, and there's a lot of debate within the techie side of the housing, the housing association side of life. My take on that is that everybody's got bathroom or shower room, and all of those should at the moment have extractor fan ventilation systems in there. And I think part of that solution, which you see on some new build properties, is where you have got that something like a heat saver, which is a heat recovery extractor fan. So that is running on a humidity basis, always running on a background level. But if the humidity builds up, it pulls that out. But what it doesn't do is suck your expensive, hard-won warm air out of that. It goes through recovery and it pushes back in. So I think there are those. I agree. It's in a cost of living crisis, to suddenly go, here's a tumble dryer, which is going to cost every hour you use it, it's going to cost you another 50 pence. Seems ridiculous.
And I think, Claire, the reality of that was when we had the consultation around WHQS initially, tenants were saying there is no room to put drying, things for us to dry our clothes on, apart from putting them on the radiator, and then the damp and mold that could potentially cause. So that was the tenant's suggestion, actually, was that the landlord should pay for a tumble dryer or pay for
and there's going to be some practical things. Kerry's made a point in there about if you gift it, who fills out the warranty. I think that's part of that practical conversation we need to have into interpreting WHQS. Who owns it, and what point, and where does the warranty fit and stuff. The other thing I was going to mention, though, is, as David suggested about these ventilation systems that recover heat and stuff, we'll have a consumer confidence issue with that, though. I know there's tenants from ADRA here. I know there's some tenants from Dravalis. PIVs, their pre-runner, did get a lot of flack, did have a lot of concerns, and didn't always sit well with tenants in terms of the cost and putting cold air back in and things like this. So even if that is a technical solution, that I think we've still got that tenant engagement, customer confidence that needs to go with these solutions.
We have two more questions,
Sure.
and we've probably got space for one more. So if anybody's got a burning question, please do put it in the chat. So we've got a question from Laura Hughes, and she says, unless I have missed something, there is something in the Renting Homes Wales. There is nothing in the Renting Homes Wales Act that allows us to do anything about a contract for a property that we know will never be able to comply with WHQS. I'm thinking that's what she's suggesting. But if I have, then please point me in the right direction, as we have one property we are in that situation with. I think that means that's around once the contract's been developed with the tenant, how we meant to amend it based on some of these compliance issues within WHQS. What I would think is that the additional terms can be amended. You know, there's the 4 lots of terms within the rented homes contract. I would think that I think it might be the supplementary terms actually, because there's 4 different names that I can't think of at the top of my head. But I think they can be amended during, as long as the tenant is in agreement with those amends.
Yes. You can't, I don't know the answer to that. I'm not going to lie. I don't know if anybody else does.
I don't know the answer to that. If the reason that property would never meet WHQS is down to energy efficiency, so that property would never reach an energy performance certificate of +92 or a environmental impact rating of +92, then there is effectively there is that acknowledgement that that everybody the sort of the general thought is that by 2033 every property has to be +92. But the reality of it is every property has to have a pathway to getting as energy efficient as it can be. But there's that recognition that not everything is going to reach that standard.
And I think that's going to be session 5. It's what happens. So there are rafter issues, Laura said, due to the fabric of the building. I'm slightly concerned. There's a number of conversations about people. I've talked to chief execs who talk about selling properties and buying different ones and things like
and
this.
She said, and the tenants do not want to move, understandably.
I think it's a number 5. I'm just conscious of the time.
Yeah.
What happens if it doesn't meet is a very, very
so basically what we're saying, Laura, is make sure you're at session 5.
Yeah.
To discuss this in more detail.
It's
final question from Kerry. If we purchase and supply the tumble dryer, do we maintain for the first year as part of the warranty? And are we legally able to sell the item to the contract holder, or would it still be classed as an asset as we have purchased the item? Do we complete the warranty in their name or property address for them to manage any maintenance issues with the purchased item? Isn't it a whirlwind of
this is it's a grown-up conversation need to happen, and I think we can get some clarification, because I read it as the landlord needs to supply it. It's part of their
assets.
Yeah, not handed over on day 1 as a pound. David's read it as handed over as a pound. I think that's part of that interpretation we're going to need to have, and the sector needs to have some grown-up conversations together as well.
Because when we speak with Welsh Government about this, they are very much like, that's a discussion that you have with your tenants. That's a discussion that you have internally as landlords. I think that they don't want to prescribe information, and for you to kind of decide that amongst yourselves within each organisation. So what works best for you and
we're not going to talk about a lot of people who are impacted by this, but it is a cost. It is I think it's when we convert more above shops and things like that in the future.
That's the simple answer to that. It's going to be on a landlord by landlord basis as to how that requirement is resolved, and then what happens thereafter. Because again, there's not a lot of maintenance with the tumble dryer, but there is that requirement to pull the bit out and get all the fluff off, etc. So there are going to be those different elements.
There's a fire risk, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think as the approach of of providing textile floor coverings to to incoming new households, and those being gifted over to those new households, it's going to be on a landlord by landlord basis. But with my asset manager, with my less human asset manager, head on. It's one of those that look at, say, if we do this, then what we absolutely have to do is minimize that ongoing liability and that
Testing,
ongoing cost.
Yeah.
Okay, then I think that we've come to an end. I can see people are starting to drop off, so we're boring everybody now. We need to leave.
Yeah, I think people are going I'm hoping people have found this interesting. I hope that we'll continue these conversations. I very much, if there's people who got things afterwards, I think my email was at the beginning. Most people know it, but I can put it in the chat. If there's things you want to cover, we will. We haven't
We'll
covered
send out the
everything today.
slides, both. We'll send
Oh,
out the
yeah,
slides
yeah.
from this session, the slides from last session to all
And
of
the
those that attended.
recording
But
as
just
well. We're
just be
building a
mindful.
YouTube session. So yeah.
Just be mindful that we don't have everybody's email address on this session. We
Yeah.
only have those that have registered within the organisation. So if you booked a group pass and it's booked in Josh's name, we'll send everything to Josh,
Yeah,
and Josh
we've
will
got
have to
5
then
Laura
share.
Hughes's today, so
Yeah,
I don't know which Laura
exactly.
Hughes we were talking to. Yeah.
So yeah, so we'll have to send it to the person that's actually registered. So we will get that done, and we'll also share the next tenant pulse registration for the online briefing session next week. So please do come along to that, because it's very much linked to some of the things we've spoken about today. Yeah, I think we're.
Can I also quickly say thank you to David Bolton? You've no idea how much short notice he stepped in on this. It really was a conversation we were having at Apple State this morning. So I think he's done superb at stepping in with very little briefing. It was 8:30 this morning. We were talking about it. I'm very, very grateful for his time today. Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's one of those that I am passionate about absolutely making sure that residents are at the heart of what we do. And I'm more than happy to, as I've said, I'm more than happy to come along to future sessions, but I'm more than happy to help to work with all of you to develop particularly that WHQS 23 consultation process. It's vital.
Thank you. That's a great ending to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so
everybody.
much for coming. And
Thanks all.
yeah,
Take
we'll
care.
send that. Take care.